The Singapore Grand Prix has just finished, and honestly, it left me with a disappointing feeling having basically wasted my time for 1.5 hours to watch just 10 minutes of actually decent racing. But it raised the question in my mind, are the ground effect cars actually a failure? Now, you might be thinking, that's such a random question to think about after just watching the Singapore Grand Prix during the 4th season of these regulations. So I'm going to go all the way back to when these regulations were first announced and what concept they were based on, then to the first season they were introduced, all the way to the present day to really deduce if these regulations were that botched in today's sport that we all know and love and occasionally hate. And if you like this video, feel free to like and subscribe. It's only 2 buttons and it really helps the algorithm deliver more of my videos to more people. And before we start this video, I'd like you to tell me your most unpopular F1 opinions in the comments below, and I'll react to them, possibly with a guest, in the next video. So make sure to put your most egregious takes. Hey guys, I'm TMWF1, and let's find out if the ground effect regulations really are a failure. Before we progress further into the new ground effect regulations, we need to understand what ground effect actually is, and why F1 decided to return to it after a near 50-year hiatus. In car design, ground effects is a series of effects which has been exploited in automotive aerodynamics to create downforce, particularly in racing cars, through underbody tunnels and floor design. The most famous example in Formula 1 would be the Lotus 78, which used skirts that would stick to the track to produce extra downforce, which increased cornering speed and overall grip, which would be a massive gain in performance, allowing Mario Andretti to win the 1978 Drivers' World Championship. Many teams decided to copy this to unlock as much downforce as possible, but this had the side effect of extreme cornering speeds, which resulted in multiple high-speed crashes, 2 of which were fatal. As a result, ground effect was banned in 1983 to reduce the chances of these crashes occurring, and it remained so for 40 years. Let's time skip about 36 years into the future, and to the year 2020, when everything went to shit. By 2020, F1 cars have gotten a lot faster compared to the 80s, partly due to changes in the engine, but also due to the many changes in regulations of the floor, barge boards, front and rear wings, and so on. This essentially made the cars rapid when cornering, but this era of F1 cars were also the safest we'd ever seen. So what was the problem? Well, there were so many elements that produced downforce that the airflow of the car became turbulent. So much so that it was difficult for cars behind to follow the cars in front of them and utilize the slipstream. This negative effect was aptly named dirty air, and in short, it killed racing on certain tracks such as Hungary or Japan, which had a lot of flowing corners and essentially made the race a procession. This, as you can imagine, wasn't great for the sport. So the FIA decided to completely revamp the regulations for the 2021 season. 20% of downforce would be reduced in terms of the removal of extra downforce elements around the barge boards, rear wing and front wing, and most importantly, ground effect would make a return to make up for the loss of downforce and to reduce dirty air and therefore improve racing. As well as this, to stop top teams from overspending their way to the WCC, a budget cap of 145 million euros was to be introduced, helping teams with lower budgets to be able to compete with the frontrunners. Let's see how this was implemented in its first year of exception, 2021. So you know how I said these regulations will be implemented in 2021? Well, a little virus known as COVID-19, you may have heard of it, had something to say about that. F1 was essentially ground to a halt until the month of July, and it would therefore have put many constraints on the F1 teams to build what was essentially a brand new car with no links to older cars. So it was agreed that the regulations would be moved to 2022, and that 2021 would be the final year of the fastest generation of V6 hybrid generation cars. And honestly, because of that, we got the best title F1 in F1 since probably 2008, rare FIAW. Fresh off the back of one of the most intense title fights in F1 history, F1 was waltzing into a new era, one that promised to improve racing and give the fans the close battles that they wanted. And honestly, the 2022 Bahrain Grand Prix gave us just that. However, before we talk about the positive of the new cars, there was a problem that was becoming extremely apparent. As the center of pressure of the side pod aerofoils moved around depending on the car's speed, altitude and ground clearance, these forces interacted with the car's suspension systems and the cars began to resonate, particularly at high speeds, rocking back and forth, sometimes quite violently. This is what is known as porpoising, and over the 2022 season it will become quite a major issue for most teams, but for Mercedes in particular. Lewis Hamilton had major problems with porpoising in 2022, famously suffering from back pain at the 2022 Azerbaijan Grand Prix, having to be helped out of his car. And George Russell said extreme porpoising could lead to safety issues, and later stated he was suffering from chest pain due to extreme porpoising during the 2022 Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix. The AlphaTauri looked extremely aggressive on the straights, with its Bahrain testing footage being akin to that of someone in a mosh pit in wireless. Despite this, the ground effect cars improved racing by a large amount, with 785 overtakes compared to 599 overtakes in 2021, an increase of about 30% with one less race. There are a fair amount of problems with making the regulations comply with the drivers in terms of porpoising, but for a first year, despite the lack of a title fight past Austria, the regulations were a success. I unfortunately can't ignore the lack of a title fight in 2023. Red Bull perfected the archetype of the new regulations, with Max Verstappen winning 19 of the 22 races in 2023, with Perez, also in a Red Bull, winning 2 and the only non-Red Bull winner being Sainz in P3. It was domination which many thought boring. Despite this, there was a total of 858 overtakes, an increase of 73 from 2022 and over 250 from 2021. Whilst this increase indicated that the racing had improved, the dominance from Verstappen and even Perez over the season overshadowed the amount of competition in the midfield, despite the gap from 4th and 7th being separated by 6 points, with 3rd and 8th not far either. Throughout the season, the problem of tyre wear when following cars became apparent in the place of mostly fixed porpoising issues, with Haas in particular struggling with tyre wear in the wake of the cars. This was an issue that would slowly affect more cars as development went on and the grid got closer. The tyre problem situation was so dire at one point that during the Qatar Grand Prix, the FIA had to introduce mandatory pit stops in 18-lap intervals due to the fact that the tyre was delaminating. Coupled with extreme heat, this made for a disastrous scenario. Despite the return of a title fight, somewhat, the amount of overtakes in 2024 dropped to 636, a decrease of 220 from the previous year and over 100 from 2022, 2 years after the new regulations begun. This trend showed that the regulations' effects was actually regressing as the cars got closer together, as it would be more difficult to overtake cars that had similar pace. What also became apparent was that DRS trains actually became more frequent, as the cars had no extra pace to try and push ahead. This was especially apparent in tracks with small DRS zones like Hungary. Whilst the tyre issues were not as dire as 2023, as the FIA promoted more pit stops and shorter stints as not to preserve tyre life, races often still turned out to be one-stop ball fest as the teams would try to keep track position over trying to overtake with newer tyres. The quote-unquote title fight did go to the penultimate race, but it was very apparent from quite early on that Verstappen would win, so we still had the issue of not very close racing at the front. The constructors fight was very interesting, with a gap of 13 points separating McLaren and Ferrari, and there were 4 viable constructors that had race wins, but the 2024 season had failed to make racing action more frequent and only brought the cars closer together. And finally, we have reached the present year, and the final year that these regulations will be in effect. And honestly, it's more of a similar story to that of the Mercedes era, with McLaren taking over as the dominant constructor, winning the WCC with 7 races still left to go, and Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri miles ahead of the rest. Only Verstappen has a minuscule chance to catch them, and a lot of luck will have to go his way to do so. Quick editor's note, when I said that, the gap was around 70 points. The gap is now 35 points. Max could do this, you know. He very well could. It's not as far-fetched as I initially thought. It's very possible. There's 4 races left. The cars now have downforce rivaling that of 2021 and even 2020, with Oscar Piastri and 6 others breaking the W11's record of a 141.2 at Spa, going under the 141 mark. Dirty air was returned as a result of the extra downforce, making following cars even worse as the cars are now significantly wider than 2021. The field is usually spread out despite the introduction of DRS on the 2nd lap instead of the 3rd, and racing is at an all-time low. Only 15 overtakes at the Japanese Grand Prix, down from 48 in 2024 and 29 in 2023, and only 2 overtakes at the Monaco Grand Prix, showing that the cars are now way too wide to barely pass one another without the use of DRS and battery power. So what does this all mean? It means that these regulations fucking sucked. Hopefully the new regulations will fix this. Wait, will remove DRS users push to pass, reducing downforce by 30 to 50%? Wait, isn't this just fucking IndyCar?